Greetings and welcome to Module 2. In Module 1, you were introduced to the role and purpose of the International Profiler. In addition, you should have developed a good working knowledge of the 10 competencies and 22 dimensions it measures. While it may seem a bit overwhelming now to get your mind around these 22 things, I promise you that with practice you'll become very familiar with these in fairly short order. Module 2 moves to the all-important areas of using and interpreting the scores on the International Profiler and also conducting an effective feedback session. Let's take a quick look at the Module 1 objectives to remember where we've been, and then I'll share with you where we're headed in this module. At the conclusion of Module 1, we said that participants will understand the role and purpose of the International Profiler, develop a good working knowledge of the 10 competencies and 22 dimensions it measures, recognize links and trends across competencies, and we did some practice with that in Module 1, and finally to have a good insight into how to use the resources available at this course site. I think that you'll get familiar with the site as we work through this, and you'll find a lot of materials available for your use during and after the program. So let's look now at the Module 2 objectives. At the conclusion of this module, you will be able to understand and use the International Profiler Interpretive Report, and you'll also have the tools to conduct an effective feedback session. We'll be discussing the report in this recording, and you'll find quite a bit of information about the feedback sessions in the written materials of Module 2. So let's talk a little bit about the logistics of how this plays out. When you order tips for your clients, you'll receive the results in a format that is known as the interpretive report. This is basically an in-depth and extensive report that you'll provide directly to your clients. Your clients will complete the questionnaire and you'll receive an email notification from the WorldWorks servers that it's been completed, and then you can download the report yourself. You choose the time and the communications that will go along with the report when you send it to your client. And this essentially is an extensive report that provides the client with an overview of TIP itself and the competencies, and then it also provides them with specific information about their scores. What does this report contain? Well, if you take a look at the screen now, you'll see the essential elements of the interpretive report. It has biographical information that is supplied by the client when they complete the questionnaire. It provides their normed and range scores on the profile, and I'll be explaining shortly the difference in those scores. It includes a definition of all of the competencies, and it includes pictures, so it's a graphical report that has some visual interest, and although it has a lot of information, I think you'll find it's pretty accessible for your clients. And finally, for the highest and lowest emphasis areas on the profile, you'll find information indicating what this suggests and the relative advantages and disadvantages of these high and low scores. Okay, let's discuss actually looking at the scores. As a coach, one of the first things that I do when I receive a report is to flip to the back of the interpretive report and look at the client's actual scores. Initially, when you're receiving your early reports, you'll read through the entire report, but you'll probably find with some experience that what you're most interested in doing is looking at the scores themselves. A core competency of being a successful feedback coach is to be able to look at the scores and make sense of them. And after some experience, you'll see that those dots on the page begin to form patterns and make suggestions in your mind. So in the written materials of Module 2, you'll see samples of some of these scores. You'll see the interpretive report. There's several examples included there. And you'll see some examples of the kinds of materials that coaches send along with this feedback report. So let's actually take a look now at some scores and how the score report is set up. You should be looking now at a blank profile. While it may be a little bit difficult to read on this screen, hopefully you followed the directions to print out the slides for this presentation. And if you haven't, perhaps you want to pause this recording right now and print out these slides. In Module 1, we discussed the competencies and the dimensions, and looking at this score sheet gives you an idea of how this is laid out and how the scores are arrayed on the score sheets that you'll be seeing. You see that the major competencies, the 10 competencies, are each represented by a major square or block on the score sheet, and then each one of those is further divided into the 22 dimensions. So for example, the top block is the openness competency, and it's divided into the dimensions new thinking, welcoming strangers, and acceptance. Now, when you actually see a score sheet, there would be a dot in a box for each one of those scores. And as I mentioned, after a while, this array of dots will begin to suggest some possible interpretations for the report. I mentioned in the beginning that there is a difference. There are two sets of scores that are provided, the norm scores and the range scores, and I'd like to talk about that a little. This can be a bit confusing for new licensees. Both scores are provided in the same format that we just looked at, but they actually represent slightly different things. The range scores actually gives you an absolute score for the dimension on a scale of 1 to 100. You may recall that when you had to answer a question, you were asked to not only choose the stem that was most appropriate for you, but actually to assign a weight to it. This is a format called forced choice with discretion, so you're asked to provide some indication of your own emphasis. And in the range scores, we actually get your own emphasis as compared to yourself. So we'll know what was your highest emphasis area and what was your lowest emphasis area. And that's what you're seeing when you see the range score. The norm scores, on the other hand, take these range scores and compare you with all the other people in the database who have previously completed this instrument, and it's expressed in percentile terms. So if you look at a score and you see that you scored 90 percentile, that means that you gave that dimension more emphasis than 90% of the people who completed the questionnaire, and 10% of the people gave more emphasis to that dimension than you did. So which do you use when you're thinking about coaching? Well, actually you use both. They're different takes on the same data set, but I would say that many of us who do coaching tend to rely a little more on the norm score. So the reason for that is you may learn from your range score that you as an individual place a higher emphasis on focus on goals, for example, than anything else. But when you go to the norm score, you may learn that you place a higher emphasis on that than 95% of the people who completed this. That would give you a sense that you really have a pretty strong emphasis compared to the group who have taken completed this instrument as well. So I think that we find that the norm score actually tends to put things into perspective. You'll have more chance to practice with this as we work through the materials in Module 2. Now we're going to take a look at some sample scores, and my idea with this is to give you a look into the sort of mind process that goes on when someone with experience looks at the scores, and that should help you begin to develop your own approach. We're going to discuss a mini case, the case of Thomas now. Thomas is actually a real case. It's a real person that I worked with. His name wasn't Thomas, and he's not the person in this picture. And I've changed a few facts, but essentially this is a real case, and the scores were actually Thomas's results. So the first thing you need to do is know a little bit about background about Thomas, because you can't really do any effective feedback without knowing some about your client. So you would get some background from the questionnaire that the client completed. You would have sent some advance information to ask some of this. You'll hear about that in Module 2. And you'll also devote some time in the beginning of the first feedback session to discussing background. So who is Thomas? Well, Thomas is someone who worked for a global corporation. Basically, it was an American corporation, but now is located around the world. And he was an educational counselor and a curriculum expert in the corporate education program there. His job basically was to work with subject matter experts in his company from all around the world to try and figure out what would be needed in the corporate education programs that his organization was providing. He also worked with university faculty members from around the world to influence their curriculum development so that they were realistic for corporate needs. In addition, he was asked to understand localization versus standardization issues regarding educational needs. So to what extent might educational programs need to be adjusted to account for local preferences? And finally, Thomas is a counselor. In his role, he provides individual coaching and guidance to corporate students, helping them match their education needs with the available programs. So that's who Thomas is. Now, as I go to look at the scores, what kind of things would I be looking for? I'd get his interpretive report, I'd flip to the back pages, and then I'm looking for, firstly, what are the very salient high and low emphasis areas that stand out and likely are important factors in this profile. If I look to the right side and the left side of that score sheet, I'll see the things that he tends to emphasize the most or the least. I'll also look for scores in areas that are really tied to his current or prospective job responsibilities. So certain competencies would be more required than others in Thomas's role, and I'd be looking at those. And finally, I'd look for significant trends or tendencies indicated by groups of scores. So this is the kinds of things we discussed in Module 1, like a push or pull emphasis, people skills, communication indicators, things like this. So let's take a look at Thomas's normed and range scores to see how we would use them. Okay, you're looking now at Thomas's actual range scores. And so I would look down the page, and I'm looking first to the right and the left sides. I notice that on the right side, there's a pretty high emphasis in the third box down. That's the personal autonomy competency, and pretty high emphasis on both inner purpose and focus on goals. Okay, I've noted that. I continue on down the page. I notice in the seventh major block down, the transparency competency, there is also high scores in clarity of communication and exposing intentions. These are both communication skills. They're the skills that relate to broadcast communication, that way Thomas, the emphasis he puts on putting his own messages out there. Okay, and then I look to the other side and I notice a very low score on learning languages. In fact, it's a 0. Thomas has 0 emphasis on learning languages. Pretty low score in acceptance above it. And as I go down the page further, also low in information gathering. So I'm beginning to form an impression here. I won't exactly say what it is yet, but I want to look at the norm scores now to see if I can get further insight about this impression. Okay, so now you're looking at the norm scores. Now we're comparing Thomas to all of the people in the database who've completed this. And I look at this and actually I go, wow, look at this. At the when I go down to the third block again, the personal autonomy, Thomas is not only high in that area, his scores are 99 and 98 percentile in inner purpose and focus on goals. That's about as high as it gets. So this is a person with a very strong sense of self and sense of direction and a very strong drive to accomplish his goals. And that begins to make me think this is a person with push orientation, as we discussed in Module 1. So let's go down the page and look at the transparency dimension. And there we see a similar picture. In the 2 broadcast communication skills of clarity of communication and exposing intentions, Thomas has a 99 percentile score. So he puts more emphasis on this than 99% of the people who've taken this. That's pretty serious. So he's really, really emphasizing this. Is this good or is it bad? Well, there isn't a good or bad. It really depends on the context. There are times when it probably is very good for Thomas to emphasize this, and then there are times when it could be overdone. So that's the kind of thing we're going to have to explore in the feedback session. And then when I look at the other side, I have some concerns because I see in some key areas, we go back to the top in the openness dimension, acceptance is a very low score in the first percentile. So acceptance has to do with accepting work practices and approaches that are different than your own. Now remember, he has to work with people around the world. He has to figure out how to localize programs. So this may be a concern. And another concern I see on the left side of the profile if I go down further, is the 3 communication dimensions that have to do with how much emphasis, I should say, he puts on received communication skills. So in attuned, which is body language, reflected awareness, how he comes across to others, and active listening, those are all pretty low. So you sort of get the picture. He may be really emphasizing what he says, but maybe not emphasizing enough to ensure that he's understanding the messages of others. I can't make this as a pronouncement. It's just an issue to explore in the feedback session. And if I go down to the cultural knowledge section, I'll see information gathering and valuing differences at 5th percentile, 16th percentile. For someone who's really charged with going around and working with faculty members, employees from all around the world, this could be a concern. So this also indicates something I have to explore. So my next step here would be to begin to formulate some questions, not answers or pronouncements, but questions to approach Thomas with in this feedback session. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of some of the beginning process of thinking about the scores. There are more issues in this profile to explore, but I just want to give you my initial reactions. Okay, let's talk about the next steps. What you should do next is to read through the remaining materials in the Module 2 webpage, and there you're going to learn more about these feedback reports, interpreting scores, and more about how to conduct a feedback session. You should use the resources there because you'll find links to see examples of reports, examples of communications, to get a little more familiar with how to approach the sharing of the scores and the planning for the feedback session. You then should complete the activities and participate in the discussions found at the Module 2 discussion area of the navigation bar. And you were provided with a course schedule, so you'll know when you have to complete those activities. You'll find some interesting things there, I believe. One of the activities is a mini case, a lot like Thomas, where you'll learn a little bit about the person and see his scores, and then you'll be asked to share some of your reactions in the blog area. And I will also be sharing your scores on the International Profiler with you this week. So if you haven't received them already, you'll receive them soon, and you're asked to provide some reactions to your own scores in this section, and that's always an interesting discussion. And finally, you should then have this all done so that you're ready to participate in the live web conference that takes place at the end of Module 2, and you have a course calendar that provides the dates for that. That's an interesting session because in that I'll share with you some difficult and challenging questions you might get in a feedback session and ask for your ideas on how we might answer them. We'll take a look at another mini case in that module, and that's another real case from my personal coaching background. And finally, I'm going to actually conduct a demo session on providing mini feedback to one of you. So I'll be asking for volunteers in email at the right moment, or volunteer, and the first person who's interested can step forward and agree to be our guinea pig so that you can see a little bit about what a feedback session would look like. So I hope this gives you a good sense of thinking about scores and motivates you to work carefully through the materials in Module 2. And I'll look forward to hearing your comments on the blog and also to speaking with you again in Module 3. Thank you.